Okay. So I'll be reading from my book, Instructions for an Animal Body. And the first poem I'm reading is titled Bear Need. There was once a bear who needed me so within the acidic warmth of her digestion that she chased me up and over the mountaintop, across ridges made of shattered volcanoes, snow to my knees, a rope for the crevasse I could not see. I would place my hand inside her tracks and look at the trees where I thought I could see her face. But it was just the way a tree will look at you with all the eyes of twisted bark. I collected moss to place between my legs, soaking up my blood scent with the green of wildwood, then burned it in the lick of fire, letting my fertility smoke up across the snow-blown mountain night. How she wanted to see me pregnant, how I avoided this calling. My bear was right outside the fire's light, watching me eat flour and onions from my hands. She loved me so hard, she chased me strong with those beastly shoulders smelling of musks and root. That's what we think, that to devour is to love, till we learn the breath of the beast as teeth sink. For years, that bear chased me till my feet cracked, and a day came that I made my way down off that mountain, stumbling to the flatlands where the men had guns, and I called back up to her next time.
Kelly Gray, welcome to Sonoma Sounds.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that. So to start off with, where are you recording from?
I am located in Camp Meeker, which is outside of Occidental, about 9 miles away from the ocean.
And did you grow up in West County?
I didn't grow up in West County. I was born in San Francisco. I'm actually seventh generation
Oh,
San
wow.
Franciscan. Yeah. And I've grown all down, up and down the coast of California, mostly in the Bay Area in West Marin, and went to high school in Tamales. So I feel like this has always been a part of my backyard.
Uh-huh. Um, and so how long have you been in Camp Meeker?
I've been here 9 years now.
Wow. Okay. Um, in your dedications to in Instructions for an Animal Body, you wrote about drives in the Mojave Desert with your dad, who would play detective novels on cassette tape. And
Yeah.
that made me curious about a few things. So, to start, does your dad have a background in writing or any sort of creative endeavor?
Yeah, he does. Not in writing. He's actually a very uh, well-established photographer, and he's spent his whole life doing race car photography, which is certainly niche. And if you are in the world of race car photography, you know who he is. And if you're not, you wouldn't necessarily. um, but yeah, and so I grew up kicking around with him in the photography studio and watching someone make a living as an artist, which is uh, hard to watch sometimes and really inspiring other times.
Mhm. And you, um, so driving through the desert, that's one scene that I can envision there, but also a lot of your poetry has a lot of um, kind of ecological aspects to it, I feel. And so I'm wondering, what is the role of landscape and climate, or biome, however you want to conceptualize it, in your creative process?
Yeah. Um, for this book, but for much of my writing, I'm really interested in looking at the relationships between trauma and grief, and then centering into one's body into a healing place. And when I was writing this book, I was writing it while I was in Camp Meeker. I was very much invested in the landscape around me and spending, that's really how I write, is by walking and observing and then bringing that back into my writing. But of course, anyone that's paying attention right now is thinking about climate change and, the collective grief that we're feeling over that. And for me, some of the healing that has to do with that is really acknowledging that we are not separate from any of it. And so I hope to bring that out in my writing, as well as our own complicity in that process.
Mm-hmm. And you also seem very knowledgeable about nature, and you use words like cetology and mycelium. And do you have an academic background in biological sciences or anything, or is this?
I don't have an academic background in anything. Nothing. But I am a certified naturalist. I did my training in Sonoma County through Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods, their naturalist training, which I highly recommend for anyone. But long before that, I was self-taught, and have always been, as many writers, an avid reader. But I really do love reading nonfiction, and most of that is science-based or nature-based writings. And to me, it's just another language or another dialect that's a part of my language that allows me to talk about these things.
And to kind of go back a little bit to that scene of you in the desert with your dad, what influence do you think that detective novels had on your writing?
More than probably meets the eye. I think that from a very young age, my dad and his father really passed on this legacy of needing to be a good storyteller. And although they weren't necessarily putting a curriculum in front of me, one of the lessons through these detective stories is that observation is everything, and that you're always observing people and landscape as a way to set up and tell a story and actually figure out what's going on. I don't read detective novels now, but when I go to visit my dad and my stepmom, often we are watching BBC and watching detective shows, and I still totally get involved in them, and that thrill of trying to figure something out through observation has always been an important part of my writing, and also just a part of my life. I was a union organizer for a long time, and I was also a birth worker and attending births. And then when I was doing my studies as a naturalist, I really got wrapped up into the world of wildlife tracking. And from there, I ended up working at the Santa Rosa Bird Rescue Center as one of the raptor handlers, and was working with the birds of prey on my wrist. And although all of those things might seem really different, the thing that they have in common is that they require a high level of observation and reaction time and adaptability based on your observations. And I feel like that's what writing is about too, is it's observing and then adapting to what you're seeing and kind of transforming it into future story.
Yeah, definitely. To me, reading some of your work, I could feel the influence of the detective stories.
I'm really interested in that nobody made that correlation before, and my father will be thrilled to hear.
I don't know if I would have picked up on it had I not read the introduction beforehand, but reading that, like going in knowing, oh, she grew up listening to this stuff, that I could see it.
Yeah.
But how about another poem?
Sure, I would love to. So this one is called Pulling Bastard. Come here, monster child. I lead weary. I take your hand and look at your knees, your ankles with flea bites, your eyes cocked. Come here, monster child. I see you in me. Give me your palm. We lick piss into prayer. We lick like our hearts are made of milk. We lick like their 3 is infinity, but we know that it was only ever, not like that, not like this. Put that down. Come here, monster child, with your crown of busted. Let me straighten your collar and see the underside of your chin, the place where your laughter is catapult rock. Unhinged, you say, me with my sewing kit, needles for eyes. 2 breaths like blow. Dust settles again on the shoulders. Don't be so mechanical with your brain like a machine. Our rested smarts. I'll dive backwards into the pool, dreaming of gators. I offer a leg.
Thank you. So with monster child, that phrase, it makes me think of another kind of theme in your work, which is that of ghosts and the spirit world. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that. Like, is it a metaphor for you, or do you believe in the supernatural? Like, how do you think about those things?
There's so many different ways I could answer that. I want to start by saying I don't think that we have great language for what I believe in or what I think about. Certainly living in the forest, one cannot doubt supernatural powers that shape-shift among us. My family that raised me were atheists, but we have several ghost stories within the family that are told in the most literal sense, as in very real. We don't believe it, but they don't believe in anything else, right? So I was kind of raised with this idea, like, yeah, they're there, and sometimes they show up, but they're not connected to any religious belief, and they're not necessarily seen as like a superstition, or what we would consider supernatural, because I think maybe that word places it outside of something that feels a little bit more personal. But in writing this book, the ghosts that I'm often writing about are representative of lost relationships, or sometimes literally people that are no longer with us. And sometimes the ghosts take the form of myself and my child self, which feels very separate to me now. And I often look back on it, and because of that separation, it almost seems like a ghost-like apparition that comes back to talk to me about things. So those are some of the places that it picks up.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you ever, as a writer, even if you're writing from your own perspective, but from a time in your life when you're very different, if only because you were a little kid, does that give you, I'm wondering how much you can separate yourself from that, or if the mere act of trying to write from your own prior perspective is kind of a distancing thing, if that question makes sense.
I think it does. Tell me if my answer makes sense. I certainly use a lot of, devices to help create distance when I feel, if I am too close to it, that it will muddy or ruin what I'm trying to write in some ways. And sometimes it doesn't matter. I just write because I have to work something out, and it's not about creating something that will be shared with someone else. but I've definitely, one story, a short story that I wrote that was published by Atticus Review. It's called Coyote Story. And I had tried writing this story several times, and it felt like I was burdening my audience with the trauma of it. And it felt too personal. Not that I minded sharing it, but I felt like it was too much to put on other people. And so the device that I ended up using for that story was actually making all of the characters animals that were living within a human world. And that's also fun for me, because then when you're creating that distance, you also have to set the terms of the universe and create the rules for the reader so that it remains plausible and makes sense as they're going along. Anyone who reads that story will likely know that it's autobiographical, although they also know that I'm not a coyote. Like, right?
How can we be sure, though?
Okay, well, you can't. That's and yeah, so I think that there are times where things feel too close or too personal. I was really excited that you guys were able to share My Fingers or Whales and Other Stories of Satology, because within that chapbook, there are many stories that are told within it that are very fantastical and have lots of untruths within them, because it's the only way that I can talk about my family and have it still actually sound true. Because sometimes we're actually saying the truth, it's not story, it doesn't sound right. But by putting it into something that's bigger than what it is, it's easier to communicate that way.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask about dreams, because that seemed to be another recurring theme for you. Um, how did those figure into your creative process?
Ever since I was young, in fact, some of my first memories are actually memories of my dreams. I have a very vivid dream life. And I'm pausing because it's actually problematic. It's not something that I typically enjoy. It wakes me up. When I was younger, I was very scared of the dreams. They were often really violent and horrific. And as I've gotten older, I'm able to calm myself very quickly when I wake up from them. And so they take on a different tone now, where really they're worlds that I get to explore and figure stuff out. But they take up equal time in my mind and my life, because I dream so prolifically. I mean, it's like on and on and on at night. And so to write to them is just like writing to my day world. It feels very similar in some ways, and I'm often processing what's actually happening through my dreams. And so they do tend to pop up. And if I am stuck dealing either with writer's block or just trying to get something going, then I'll just loop back to the dream that I had the night before and start writing that out. It's like my go-to like internal prompt that I have.
Changing gears a little bit, do you consider your poetry to be part of a school or a tradition of poetry? Or to put it another way, what writers do you draw inspiration from?
Sure. Well, you'll have to answer that same question. I'm curious if you saw it within a school.
Uh-huh.
So I said before, I don't have any academic training. I didn't go to school. I made it through high school and was really lucky for that. And then I took classes and have always been really engaged in educating myself, but not in an academic way. So if you tell me what school you think it belongs in, that'll be like my first indicator. I don't know. But I can tell you I have writers that inspire me. There's so many. Some of them aren't poets. I don't only write poetry. I write short story as well. But from a very young age, it was the confessional poet, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, those authors really shaped me. I'm really interested in writing the deeply personal and exposing some part of myself that maybe I wasn't even aware of until I started to write the poem. I have been faced with people telling me that I write nature poetry, and I like that feels very precious to me. And it also feels very like older white man, like John Muir style, in a way that repels me from that. And I think that the reason that I'm repelled from being blocked into nature poetry is because I don't see nature as something that is separate from us. And so it would be like if someone said that I'm writing women's poetry, I would also be like, no, 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 that's not right either. So I could go for confessional. Yeah, and now the poets that inspire me are, the list is outrageous. I'm not even going to try to start going down the list. And during the pandemic, that was pretty much all I could read was poetry. I had a really hard time writing or reading anything that was longer because my attention span was just fried and frazzled. I'm sure like many people's were. And so I probably read more poetry during the pandemic than I actually have in my life. I'm usually reading fiction.
Yeah, I don't think I could put you in a box with the school, if only because I'm not knowledgeable enough about the different schools myself. Um, but your poems also take on many different forms. Some of them are in paragraphs, some are in lists, some are in stanzas, and I'm wondering if that's something that kind of grows organically, like you just start writing and it assumes a form, or do you shape something into a form like more manually?
Yeah, it can, there's not one way that I start. I tend to gravitate towards prose, prose poetry, but as of late, I've become more interested in refining my line breaks and creating more meaning within a line break than I ever have before. So that's something, stanzas and couplets are probably, and if I have a next book, then there would likely be more of that and that. But typically when I'm writing, I am writing to images and feelings, and I'm hoping to create a sense of a feeling without using descriptors and using imagery and placement of people or characters within the poem. And so it's less important to me, or maybe not important to me at all, whether it's a prose poem or stanzas or what have you. But as I'm writing it, it starts to take form. But I've definitely had the prose piece where I'm like, oh, wait, nope, this doesn't work as prose. I need to actually break it up to create more pauses and visual space and blank space to let things settle in. But I have a couple different writing voices, and although they're consistent and maybe perhaps not distinguishable to someone else, but I know that I have about 3 writing voices, and one of them really only works in prose, and it's a little bit more manic, like it's barely taking a breath for air. And it's those pieces I know when they're happening. And then when I'm a little bit more slow and the subject matter is a little bit more less fiery, less fueled, then stanzas make more sense for me.
And when you go back, say you have a prose poem and you are like, this isn't working, I want to break it up. Is the breaking up process merely like moving things on the page, or do you end up changing the words too when you change the form?
I can. Often my revision process is more lengthy than the writing process. So I tinker with and tweak things quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
but I usually don't change the imagery very much, but I might very well change like the order of something where I realize that something doesn't chronologically make sense, or I need to make something more clear. I also end up cutting out quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I have had to learn how to, I'm not very patient by nature, and I like to write it and then I like to spend an afternoon revising it with a lot of attention, and then I feel like it's done. And I've been really trying to teach myself to put it down
Mm-hmm.
and come back to it maybe a week or 2 weeks later and see what I see at that point, which is often, a really wonderful tool that I seem really resistant to. I don't care to share here.
Yeah. um, do you often work on multiple poems concurrently, or like where you might put it off for a week to return to it and then work on something else, or?
Sometimes, yeah, I'm a part of a really wonderful little writing group where we workshop each other's poetry or short stories. And so often I think that I'm done with something and then they're my final eyes on it. And I really trust their advice. And we're all really different writers with really different voices, but we all, I think, really like and respect each other's work. And so they'll give me feedback and I get to pick and choose what feedback makes sense for it. But often they find something that once they say it, I'm like, whoa, I didn't even see that in the poem. And it might be something as simple as repeating words, or it might be a statement that is cliche that I'm not familiar with, or just did not apply to this. And all of us as writers want to avoid cliche as much as possible. And so they'll catch things for me, and that's really helpful. I'm kind of to the point where I'm like, I don't know how I wrote anything without a group of people telling me what was horrible about it before. So after that, I will go back to pieces, but typically because I spend so much time with them when I'm doing them, I tend to kind of like dig them into the dirt, and then I'm done at that point.
Cool. Well, how about another poem then?
This one, I want to give this one a trigger warning. The title will explain it. So it's called When the Shooter Comes, Instructions for My Daughter. I want you to crouch like a badger, drop deep into your animal body to become broad and flat. Dig your set in the dirt and crawl into the dark. Wrap yourself with worms and mycelium. He may not see you in the tangled roots. You will hear his footsteps vibrate above. Be quiet, be quiet. Listen, we do not have time for your human needs. Do not call me. I know that you love me. Hold the thickest book to your heart and remember when I read to you. Forget all the metaphor and go deep into the closet. Sit still as the broom and steady your breath. Think of the possum, your favorite animal, emitting the smell of decay to trick the predators among us. I'll think of your small hands wrapped in wool as we drive the cold roads to school.
Thank you. What was it like to write that poem?
That one, I received a call from one of my dearest friends. We've known each other for most of our lives, and she has a child who's older than my child. And she was near hysteria, and she said, there's a potential shooter at my daughter's school, and the kids have been ordered to pile on top of each other and the rooms are locked, and my child has her phone and she's calling me and she's having a panic attack and I don't know what to do. And so I stayed on the phone with her as her daughter was texting her, and because she had told her, hang up, do not make any sounds, you can text me. And it was this really real thing. And I was feeling for them, and I was also feeling for my own child and my own role as a mother. And her daughter is about 4 or 5 years older than my daughter, and she had talked to her child about what to do in this event. And I realized I had not talked to my child about what to do if this were to happen. And I had not shared with my then, 8-year-old that these types of things happen in the world. And I knew that I needed to talk to her about it. And so I was trying to sit down to write my bullet points of what I wanted to say, because I felt like I really wanted to stay on point. It's an important conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to give too much that would scare the shit out of her, or like not enough information, because I knew she was going to have questions. And I couldn't quite get my bullet points out. And so I was like, okay, just write it, like really say what you want to say to her. And you don't have to say that to her, but just get it out of your system. And so this poem came from that, me sitting down to write a letter to her about what I really wanted for her in that moment. And what I wanted her to know was I wanted her to really connect with her animal self and be really intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
And not go into your human thinking brain. And I also wanted her to know that I loved her and that she didn't need to worry about me in that moment. I wanted her to worry about her. So that's how that poem was born. And it felt like shit. I didn't like writing it at all. To answer your question, frankly, it was not enjoyable to me. And I've read it once at a public reading and people were in tears. I don't particularly even enjoy reading it. Mm-hmm. But I picked it today to read because the schools are back open, and we had this, in so many ways, this really horrific year where the kids weren't in school. But the one thing that I'm sure like many parents, I was like, well, there's not going to be any school shootings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a segue, but unfortunate parts of modern life here. Aside from school shootings, there's wildfires, there's COVID, and one of your poems was actually 25 Things I Want During a Pandemic, and you've already mentioned that you've read more poetry during the pandemic than before. How else has the pandemic affected you as a person and as, a writer?
Yeah. For me personally, it was really challenging. Mm-hmm. In the same ways that it was really challenging for many people. I think one of the epiphanies I had during the pandemic was that I, because of experience, feel like I'm pretty adept at dealing with individual trauma, but collective ongoing trauma, I don't like it. I don't like having to process with everyone what's going on at all. And so there were times where I was really, really isolated. I live somewhere where I don't see people on the regular. I wouldn't leave my house for weeks at a time. There was a point where I thought that I had, that my relationship with my child was broken permanently because it was just the two of us. I mean, talk about cabin fever, right? Mm-hmm. And then we had a slew of illnesses in my family, and also with her. And then we had fire season overlapping that. And last year for the area that I lived in was a really intense fire season where we had multiple evacuations that during the pandemic. And one of those evacuations was absolutely wonderful. We evacuated to my friend's house in Berkeley. We saw people for the first time in months. I was absolutely convinced that my house was going to burn down during that evacuation, and that it was projected to. And I was having a breakdown while simultaneously feeling my friend's arms around me, holding me, and eating Ethiopian food. It was really surreal and wonderful.
Yeah.
So that, everything that could have been hard was amplified during the pandemic, and it seemed like everyone, like, it was like one thing after another, not to mention like what was going on politically. However, for writing, that's really good for me because when I am suffering, I write my best work when I am not just suffering, but when I am working through something, when I'm curious about something, when I'm trying to process something. And parts of it I haven't even been able to write about yet, but much of it I could. And in this book, there's certainly pieces of the pandemic towards the end of the collection that start to crop up, because that's when I was finishing writing it. So it's complicated to say that it supported me in that, and I'd like to think that I could find other horrible things to engage with other than a global pandemic to keep my writing going. But it was good that way. And the silence was good for me as well. The lack of outside, the feelings of needing to socialize, not having to drive my child to school, like it just opened up a lot of time for me to write. And I need a lot of time to write. I'm thinking about writing something. I have like 10, anywhere between like 10 minutes to 2 hours of struggle of thinking I should be doing something else before I just write the thing that I want to write. And in the pandemic, that kind of freed me up. I felt less struggle. I could just like drop into something because everything was struggle. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you not only wrote poetry, you wrote a play called Beautiful Monsters. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote Beautiful Monsters towards what I now think of as like the beginning of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I wrote it reads as if it's a play, but I wrote it really as a short story. And it was published as a short story. And it was one of these pieces that I actually felt really conflicted about. I didn't know how I felt about it. I had spent a lot of time on it, but every time I tried to read it from beginning to end, I hit a wall with it, and I didn't want to read it. But when I finished it, I just kind of sent it off to this one place thinking they're probably, really probably not going to publish it at all. And right away they're like, we love it. And they published it. And I was like, oh, that's so weird. I have no idea really what this piece is about or how I feel about it. I mean, I knew what it was about, but I wasn't sure how I felt about it. And a friend read it and loved it, talked to me about it at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm so glad that it resonates with you. Excellent. And I didn't think about it again. And then she was opening her winery up for events this last summer, and she contacted me and she said, I'd really like you to produce the play here. And I was like, I definitely cannot do that. I have no experience producing play, like none at all. And maybe when I was younger, I would be like, sure, and swagger into that mistake, but I didn't. And so what I ended up doing was contacting a couple people I knew and then had been directed towards Left Edge Theater, and I submitted it and they contacted me. I mean, it was like the next day and they were like, we love this. It's unusual. It's practically unproducible. It's dark and strange, and we want to see what we can do with it. And so the art director, Argo, who's really lovely and brilliant, had a background in this old Russian style of street theater where they use everything from acrobatics to music to theater to tell a story. And so they did it in that style. And it ended up being at Horse and Plow Winery for 3 nights. It sold out, which blew my mind. It was, for many people, one of the first things they did live in person. And then it was at the Luther Burbank Center within the Left Edge theater that they have there. And it ran for 2 weeks there. And that is that whole story. That's how that went down. It was really weird and surreal because I didn't set out to be a playwright, and I learned a lot. I learned about my own comfort levels and what it means to collaborate, not just with an art director, but with a whole cast and crew of people that have their own interpretations, and they're taking something that's so private and personifying it in a way that's so much, it's tangible. And what hadn't really occurred to me until like the week before it opened was that I was going to have to sit in the audience and watch, and I was going to have to watch other people watching. And that was really hard for me. I'm not sure that I would choose to do that again. I was really rattled by that.
Did you find your attention divided between the audience and the stage?
The first night, for sure. And it was opening night, and I had all 3 nights I had people that I knew very well and people that I just know from around town were there. I was watching folks and listening to their reactions. One of the things that surprised me is that people would laugh at things that I didn't think needed to be laughed at. That happens to me a lot in my work, where people will like laugh out loud at something, and it always surprises me when they do that. I mean, I think that I might be talking about something that's absurd, and it might be a dry wit, but it can make people laugh sometimes. And that's new. Like, I just don't expect that.
Do you find that happened in any of the darker bits where maybe it was a reaction to process the darkness rather than thinking, hee, this is funny?
For sure. Also, going back to that collaborative piece, the art director did a lot of things to it that were not at all within the play that I had written. And so there was lots of music that wasn't a part of my play. There, not extra characters. Well, I guess, no, technically extra characters. They kind of like divvied up some of the narrator's voice into different types of characters. And one of the things that Argo was, I think, very smart about it was that he wanted to offer the audience levity, whereas as a poet, I'm like, no, we're not dealing with any levity. And he was like, they'll be crying on the ground at the end of this, and sometimes that's okay, but I think we should lighten it up. And so sometimes people were responding and laughing to that, and sometimes people were just crying or laughing because they were out in public for the first time watching something that was about the pandemic.
Yeah. What are you working on these days?
Actually, I'm working on something that is really, really hard. I'm continuing to write poetry and short stories like I normally do, and I have a manuscript that I'm working to get like out into the world of please accept me as a published work somewhere. But I am taking a workshop with a poet by the name of John Sibley. He's really fabulous. I recommend reading his poetry and taking his writing workshops. He's really kind and wonderful and smart. And so I'm taking a cento workshop with him. Are you familiar with cento?
No, is it John Sibley Williams?
Yeah, John Sibley. Sorry, I didn't say his last name. John Sibley.
Yeah,
Williams.
I know him personally, actually.
Oh, wonderful.
I live in Portland, and yeah, my wife went to grad school with him. Pure coincidence, but yeah.
So then you know how sweet he is and what a great poet he is. Sorry, I totally skipped on his last name.
Okay.
And it's my second workshop that I've taken with him. And so cento is a form of poetry. It's the name derives from the Latin word for patchwork. And so it's cento and erasure work. and found poetry. So specifically in Cento, you take lines from other poets and you piece them together to create a new poem that sometimes may be in conversation with itself about the two different works, or in conversation with something that might be politically or culturally relevant. And so this is going to loop back to your question about dreams.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always just kind of ignored Cento or erasure work. I didn't really get it. It didn't resonate with me when I read it. And I had a dream that I was working on a murder ballad through patchwork, through Cento, and trying to piece it together. And it was really, really hard. And I was trying to have some sort of commentary on murder ballads, and I couldn't quite get it. And anyway, I was like, just woke up so frustrated, and I was like, what? And I think that might be the first time I had a dream about writing a poem before, but it wasn't even me writing, it was someone else's murder ballads. And then that morning, I got an email from John Sibley Williams saying, I'm offering this Cento workshop. Can I take it? And I was like, well, I'm now obligated to take it. And so I sent him an email, which I'm sure sounded really Northern California woo-woo, where I'm like, I had a dream. But I did. And so that's what I'm working on now. And I'm hoping to do a chapbook of Cento pieces from murder ballads, traditional and modern. And I don't quite, there's a lot of different ways I could go with that. I think the idea of murder ballads basically being like a whole genre about gaslighting women's experiences of being murdered, right? And glamorizing it. Working with erasure poetry and working with Cento is a really interesting way to like redo that. So that's what I'm for this fall. I'm diving into that world. I do want to say it's difficult for me reading a lot of these murder ballads. You know, they're by nature really gruesome. Mm-hmm. And the other day, I read about 15 of them all at once, and I was like, oh, I have to take a break while I'm doing this. I mean, I'm dark, but I'm not like murder dark. You know?
Yeah. Well, I know in the like old time music community, there's been a lot of discussion about murder ballads, and there's something that still draws people to them, even as our society has changed and we recognize how extremely problematic they are. Um, there's a haunting quality to them often that keeps people coming back to listen, which is very interesting. So I'd be very interested to see what you come up with.
I mean, you know, as you're saying that, I would be better placed to do it if I was still reading detective novels and like watching CSI shows, which are right, are all about like, what woman do you want to see get like raped and murdered this week?
Right.
But that's really like the murder ballads was that genre, you know. Yeah, there's a lot to explore there.
Before we go, where can people find your work?
Yeah, so you can go to Moontide Press and you can purchase instructions for an animal body there. You can also visit me at my website, which is writekgray.com. I'm sure you'll leave that somewhere for people. You can also go to Moonchild Press to read or listen to my audio chapbook of My Fingers Are Whales and Other Stories of Satology. It's about a 20-minute listen. And I collaborated with a really brilliant woman, Meredith Johnson, who is a sound documentarian. She has a podcast called Origin Stories for the Leakey Foundation. And she created this really beautiful soundscape. And so you can go to Moonchild Press and just download it and listen to it for free. Or you can go to your local Sonoma County Library and listen or check out either one of these, which makes me super excited.
Yeah. So what poem will you be reading to take us out?
So to take us out, I was going to read Poem of the Seamstress. I am lungs of house, a glass-spanned wall, hung chandelier of larynx and trachea, each breath bringing minutia of volcano particles, soil-slanted light, call it dust at noon. I am mouth of house, tilted bookshelves, tiles decorated with bird song, poet's ink, screaming to open bound tombs, assuring me of want, as dry as my mouth is. I am bowels of house, singing pretty with apparitions who have haunted these hallways all along. Water heater creak louder than boot kick can fix. Bags of stomach, flush pipes. Linked between eyelids, teeth made of tendons, broad planks of wood, a tub to wash words in, clawed. I am hollow of house, needlewoman, double-crossed on floor, filled eyes and fabric scraps, each stitch pushing blood into seams of curtain drawn across crowds of mannequins and fruit eaters. Only tea cloth pressed to inner thigh receives blood chimney and embroidery. My kettle rattles against closed door of home.